Eli, שלא ייגמר לעולם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, ברק השמיים, תפילת האדם. Oh Lord, my God, we pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart. Good evening, everyone. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the presence of several survivors here with us tonight. Lechol ish yesh shem. To every person, there is a name, and to every name, there is a story. Tonight, we will hear the story of two people, Shlomo and Chana Ryback, and their escape from the ghetto through a tunnel to join the powerful Jewish resistance in the Bielski's forest, Jerusalem. In the words of the great Elie Wiesel, listening to a witness makes you a witness. And I think that I speak for all of us here tonight. To you, the survivors, we pledge to keep telling and retelling these stories and to educate those around us. In doing so, we honor our survivors, our loved ones, and the over 6 million Jews and the millions of other human beings. May their memory be a blessing. Yehi zichram baruch. Amen. I'd like to introduce Howard Stotland and to thank Vivian and Howard for bringing this program to our attention and for sponsoring the film screening. And I call on Howard to introduce tonight's program.
Thank you, Adam. Adam started with singing Eli, Eli. I'm such a lucky guy. I traveled with Adam on the March of the Living. I think 3 times. Adam was responsible for a lot of the ruach, the spirit on the trip. And I heard him sing it again tonight because that's such a key song for the whole Holocaust, Hanish Sanish and her song. Last January, I was lucky to hear the presentation that we're going to hear in a couple of minutes, done on our lake in the country, on Lake Manitou. It was done for our neighbors and friends. And I was so impressed with the evening that right after I contacted Adam and I said, we have to do this for the Sharazine congregation. And then Adam came up with 2 terrific and really smart ideas. He said, let's do it and tie it into Yom HaShoah. And let's show the movie, because this whole story that you're going to hear ties in with the movie Defiance. And I did watch the movie again last night. Haven't seen it in, I guess, 11 years. And it's really good. If you've seen it, and if you haven't seen it after you hear Sylvia and her family tell the story, I think you'll want to go watch the movie. It is on again tonight, Adam, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce Sylvia Sklar, my friend Sylvia Sklar, who the story is about out of the forest, but Sylvia will say she always sees me in the forest because we do a lot of hiking together. And that's how we got to know each other over the last 4 or 5 years. Sylvia will be talking with her daughter, Dr. Alissa Sklar, and her granddaughter, Maya Hillcoat. And they'll tell the story, as Adam mentioned, about her parents. So I'd like to pass it over to Sylvia to tell us the story.
So I'm going to start us off here, if that's all right. I want to thank you, first of all, Howard, for the wonderful introduction. I want to thank you and Vivian for sponsoring the showing of the film. And of course, we want to thank the Shar Zion and Adam for inviting us to do this. It means so much to us, to our family, to help keep the memory of my grandparents' story alive. And in doing so, to keep alive the memory of all of those that we lost in the Holocaust. And there's just so many stories that we're never going to get to hear. This is just one of them that we're happy to share with you this evening. So I'm going to get us started here, and I just want to make sure that you can see my screen, the first slide on here. We're going to dedicate tonight's presentation to a woman named Tamara Vershitskaya. She is the director of the Museum of Jewish Resistance in Novogrodek. At least she was until very recently. Although not Jewish herself, she has dedicated her entire life to preserving, documenting, archiving, sharing, and promoting all of the stories of the survivors of the ghetto, of the tunnel escape, of the Bielskis, and many of the resources that we'll share at the end are as a result of her work over decades, really. You probably haven't heard that much about Belarus in the news recently, and that does not mean that things are not happening. Cameras are being broken, bones are being broken, and Tamara has been removed from her post because she dared to give a tour to the Museum of Jewish Resistance to some people who were involved in the protests in Minsk. So it's just a reminder that around the world, continue to be many injustices and many righteous people who are fighting to see them righted. So we wanted to acknowledge her work. She remains a dear friend of the family. And I'm going to turn this over to Maya then to get us started.
So this is not my great uncle Ephraim Ryback. And I'm showing you this picture, which is really a photo of my uncle Jamie as a toddler, because there are no images of Ephraim, who died around this age. And there's no birth certificate, and there is no death certificate. There's no proof at all that he ever really lived. And we're here to tell his story so that he's not forgotten, along with the stories of his parents, my great-grandparents, Chana and Shlomo Ryback, and the many others who were part of the tunnel escape and the resistance. So hello, my name is Maya Hillcoat, and I'm a third-generation descendant of Holocaust survivors. And I heard some of these stories about my great-grandparents while I was growing up, but it always seemed really far away in some distant past that didn't really have an impact on my life today. Working on this project, though, has made it feel a lot more real and a lot more tangible to me. I'm a first-year student at liberal arts at Dawson, and last spring, I had planned to join my peers on the March of the Living trip to Poland, which was unfortunately canceled because of the pandemic. But doing this presentation, I'm so proud to be able to help keep these stories alive. And of course, you've already heard my mom speak, Alissa Sklar, who is a second-generation descendant, and she grew up hearing these stories, but she got to hear some of them from the sources themselves.
Thank you, Maya. It's always a pleasure to be introduced by my own daughter. Many of you may have watched the film Defiance that Howard and Vivian generously supported the viewing of it. As Howard has said in the introduction, if you missed it the first time around, there'll be another viewing of it through the Shar as well, and we invite you to take a look at that. Tonight, we're going to tell you how my grandparents took part in the largest successful escape of Jewish prisoners from a Nazi labor camp in the Shoah to make their way to the resistance fighters known as the Bielski Partisan Camp, which is where they lived until liberation in 1944. Now, I was actually really close to my grandparents. They played a very big part in my life. They didn't like to talk about this. I knew only very vague outlines of their lives. I know that my grandfather could make anything out of a wire hanger or a stick. Nothing in their house was wasted. They used every single apple on their apple tree. And he loved up north at our country house to show me the edible nuts and berries. He would pick up sticks on the forest floor and carve them into walking sticks for all of his grandchildren. He made gefilte fish out of the lake, the trout and the fish that we pulled out of the lake. So so in that sense, I kind of understood that he was a survivor and he was a very resilient person, as was my grandmother. And it really became real in the summer of 2019. My mom and I and my uncle Jaime and two of my cousins, Andrea and Lauren, traveled to Minsk to be part of the 75th anniversary of liberation of the Bielski camp in Belarus. It was just a remarkable experience. There were hundreds of participants and descendants that really came from all over the world, and we really were able to celebrate. And for suddenly, it wasn't it wasn't history, it was a story. Those were the trees that had sheltered my grandparents, and I saw the barracks that they had lived in when they were in the Nazi prison camp. And it wasn't just history anymore. It really touched me in an entirely new way. And we felt it was so important to bear witness to these two unique acts of resistance and defiance that led to the survival of so many Jews. And we're honored to share this with you tonight. And of course, I feel very fortunate to introduce my mom, who is going to talk to us as well. I'll pass this over to you, Mom.
So it is said that a person dies 3 times: in taking that final breath, upon burial, and when there is no one left to say his or her name. Today on Yom HaShoah 2021, I remember Ephraim Ryback ben Shlomo HaKohen, my little brother that I never knew. Yehi Zichrona Baruch. Growing up, there was a lexicon in our house as children that we thought everybody knew. Words like lager camp, Novogrodek, the beautiful mystical town of their origins, Partizana, ghetto. These were words that, we heard almost every day. But my twin brother, Hai, and I have very good memories of growing up in the 1950s in Montreal. Yet I remember the deep and palpable sadness that just enveloped our house at every one of the holidays and on Shabbat, especially on the holidays. The parents would walk around with deep sighs, with red-rimmed eyes. And these were our energetic parents who were so busy building new lives for our tiny family, they would suddenly change. Somehow, we knew that we had to be especially good at these times. As children, we were protected from the horror stories about the war, but we heard snatches of conversation with other greenhorns about the forest and the ghetto. There was always bits and pieces. My brother and I were really not that interested in the war stories. That's normal. But when Tuvia and Lilka Bielski drove in from Brooklyn to attend my brother's bar mitzvah, we thought he was just another greener from Europe. He had the same accent as my parents. In our eyes, he was a very ordinary looking man who drove a taxi in New York City.
All right, sorry, I'm trying to remove the Zoom controls so this doesn't obscure the screen. Hopefully that's a little bit better. I tried to move them over. Thank you very much, Mom. We also just, as my mom was describing, we want to talk about the sheer enormity of what it means to be a resistance fighter, of what the Bielskis did, of what the tunnel escape meant. And this quote from the Mishnah is very meaningful to us, that whoever saves a single life is considered by Scripture to have saved the whole world. When we consider there were 1,200 people roughly at liberation, there's over 25,000 descendants from those 1,200 souls now around the world. So this is going to bring us over to the kind of basic context here. So Novogrodek or Novogrodek, depending on how you pronounce it, this is a crossroads of the world. This was a really strong Jewish community. Yiddish is one of the 3 official languages in Belarus, and Jews actually were the majority of the population, over 60%. Novogrodek was under Polish occupation from 1920 to 1939, and then it was ceded to the Soviet Union with the von Ribbentrop and Molotov Pact. And life was really good under the Jewish occupation. I'll just pass you over to this map, and I know, Mum, that you had some things that you wanted to share about the area.
Sure. So this basically is the map that is the center of the film Defiance and the center of our story. So you can see that this whole area that said general government, the yellow and the green, that was all Poland at one point. Shortly before the outbreak of World War II, the Germans and the Soviets made a pact. And this was amazing because they were former enemies. And the pact was that they would draw a line and they agreed to take no military action against each other for the next 10 years. It was based on economic benefits for both sides, and it was known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And you see that red line there. So part of Poland was now under German rule, and the lucky part of Poland, luckier, I guess, is questionable, Novogrodek, where the parents and where the story takes place, was now under Soviet occupation. And I do mean Soviet occupation. It was better than being under German occupation, but it really was communist rule. So you can see also right at the top, the blue line, that is Lithuania, and the filming of Defiance actually took place just outside of Vilna in Lithuania, because it was too hard to get all the permits to film in Soviet-controlled Belarus. Alissa, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, so just a few more words about life in this area. This is a picture that we like to share. This was a very normal upscale community. The city itself was probably about a little bigger than the size of Senegath is now, just to give you a sense. This was not a small town by any means. There was a well-respected yeshiva. This is a picture of a girl named Michala who's dressed up for Purim in her Purim costume. And in fact, there's a statue of her, a sculpture of her that was put up at the museum to acknowledge the presence of children, just normal life, people having good times, doing the kinds of things we would expect in any normal society. And I'll turn this over to you, Mum, to talk about my grandparents, your parents.
Oh, so Chana, her maiden name was Iwinetka, was born in Novogrodek. And Shlomo, my dad, was born in Rodden. Here are some pictures of them. My parents are the handsome couple on the left, very well dressed. They always talked about the mystical, wonderful life of Novogrodek before the war. That's a picture of my father dressed up to go biking in Rodden. Those of you who know about the famous Rodden Yeshiva and the Chofetz Chaim. There's a picture of my mom. She's on the extreme right. The youth in Novogrodek or Novogrodek all belonged to some kind of group, whether it was a religious group or whether it was secular, Zionist, or communist. And this actually came out to be helpful in their survival because they had a network of friends from different areas around it and knew how to collaborate to do things. Now I turn it to Maya.
So just a word before you jump in here, Maya. I think it's just worth being said that people talk about, why did this happen here? Why was this strong tradition of partisans? How was an escape like this possible? And I think it does need to be acknowledged that a lot of this was due to fairly good relations with the non-Jews in the region, Tatars, Poles, Russians. It really was a crossroads of the world. This is a picture that we took when we were there last time of the current population. But a lot of the messages, the food, the supplies that were helped the Bielskis run the camp, whether given willingly or not, they had actually pretty good relations with a lot of the surrounding people, and they hated the Nazis far more than they ever hated the Jews. And so it is important to establish that context. This is actually a picture of some of the veterans of what they call the Great Patriotic War that attended our reunion in the 75th anniversary of the liberation, and they were sent by the government. The Belarusian government actually sent their own representatives to honor the unveiling of the memorial ball and participate in this event. So this brings us over to the defining moment, June 22nd, 1941. The Nazis invade the area. There was absolutely no notice at all. So obviously this was pre-internet, but the Soviets very carefully controlled all news and communication. So the Jews and the people living in this area had no idea the Nazis were coming until the tanks and the trucks literally rolled into their towns. And that actually established very quickly this timeline for extermination. And Maya, I'll turn this over to you at this point.
Sure. So I'm about to read a testimony from one of our cousins named Raya Kushner. And at the time, she was 16 years old. So one Saturday, the Germans asked the Judenrat to gather 50 nice-looking young girls to work. In spite of their fear, they had to obey. Their mothers were crying, terrified for their daughters, but they had no choice. The Germans took the girls to the town square where there was music being played by a small orchestra. They had gathered 150 Jewish lawyers, professors, artists, and writers, and the soldiers shot them as the music was playing. The blood was running on the stones of the square. We, the 50 girls, were required to wash the blood from the stones. We helped put the dead bodies on a wagon. The heads of the people were hanging off the back of the wagon. We knew these people. The music continued to play as we washed the blood off the stones. The Germans were laughing and dancing in the square. And on this same day, my great-grandmother Chana was home with her family, and her brother Mota was one of the men called to the square. And she told our family how he put on his suit and combed his hair before he went, and they all watched in horror from their upstairs window, so that's the one that's open up there in the brick building. They watched as he was shot. And this was her house with the window over there. And the message of intimidation and fear and compliance was very loud and very, very clear.
So here's the timeline pretty well for extermination. So Germans came in 1941. They broke that non-aggression pact with the Russians. And by slowly, they made their presence known through intimidation of like these shootings and carrying out certain people, publishing the Nuremberg laws, for instance, that humiliated the Jews to wear a yellow patch in the front of your coat. You also had to sew one to the middle of the back of your coat. You couldn't walk on the street. You couldn't own a business. So this continued. And by August 16, Jews between the ages of 14 to 60 were conscripted by the Germans, and they were forced into work groups, and they were given work papers. Chana was then 28 years old, and Shlomo was 27. They both got work papers, Chana as a nurse and Shlomo as a bookkeeper. Their baby, Ephraim, was just a little bit over a year old. These papers turned out to be passports to life in the end. Then life was pretty miserable until the day before December 6th in winter. It was very cold. An order came out to the town, and the Jews were told that they can take one bag with them, and they had to vacate their houses and assemble as follows. The disabled, elderly, families with many young children, and old people had to go to the convent. That is the building on the left. They were going to meet there. The rest of the people, including Chana, Shlomo, and their baby, that's 5,000 people, were crowded into the courtyard that you see in front of you. In the back, that white building is the courthouse. So just imagine, middle of December, freezing, 5,000 people crowded into that tiny little area. Chana, Shlomo, their baby were there too. They kept hoping there's a ghetto being built. That's what's going to happen. They're going to send us all to the ghetto. The people spent the night terrified, huddled together for warmth. Then at sunrise, they got another order. They were told, some of you are going to be allowed into the building. A selection began at the door to the building. A wave to the right or the left separated the group. Those on the right with work permits that were young, strong looking, were then marched off to their assigned work details. The rest of the people, that's about 4,500 people that had spent that night in the courtyard, were taken, marched down the road to a field where they were shot. The next picture shows the road that they were taken out, the last view of these people. Further up the road is where the Pereseker ghetto was prepared for these people. Just have to tell you, the Pereseker ghetto was about 10 houses that had been cordoned off, vacated. A gate was put up in front of it, and about 4,000 people were crowded into this tiny area. It was just absolutely inhuman. Maya, do you want to talk about the next testimony from Liuba?
Sure. So this is a testimony from Liuba Rudnicki from the Novogrodek Memorial Book. When the last group of workers returned to the ghetto, it became clear that none of her relatives and friends survived. Everyone was in deep mourning. No one lost their minds. There was no heart attacks. To this day, I cannot understand how we had the drive to survive and where we found the strength to overcome our indescribable losses.
So I'm going to bring us over to the next image here. Let's just, oh, sorry, I have to just close. I just removed some annotation, so I'm just going to close that panel. So, sorry, let's go back to here. So that's the road up to the ghetto. My grandmother talked about being walked up the hill to that. This is a model of the area that we just showed you. So you see the white courthouse, and you can see the buildings in the front that were formed the convent. The buildings on the left and the front, in the front of the picture, those actually became the workshops. So the workers whose lives were spared had skills that would have been useful to the Nazis, and those became workshops where they would practice their trade, making ammunition, saddles, sewing uniforms, things like that. The buildings on the back left with the yellow roofs, the smaller ones, eventually would become the barracks once they were moved in here. And you can see, and I'll show you in some other pictures here, the tunnel eventually is in the upper left part of the screen. You can actually see where that actually ended up being dug. So I'm going to let you, and this is actually in the current museum, is now housed partly in those barracks, which are now preserved and with displays and archived materials. And we were just absolutely amazed when we went in there to see that some of the barracks were marked with some of the names of the people who lived there, including my grandparents and their child, although it's not clear that baby Ephraim actually would have made it up until that point. And I'll let you talk about the rest of the children's action.
So following is another testimony from our cousin Raya Kushner in her book, Miracle of Life. 1942, the Germans came at 4 in the morning. They woke everyone up, and with an announcement that they were going to take the small children to a special kindergarten. I can never forget the memories of the mothers and the fathers kneeling on their hands and knees, begging to save their children. Sure enough, 3 days later, the Germans returned with German shepherds. The dogs sniffed out the hidden children. The soldiers picked up the small ones and threw them against the wall of the building. They also threw some high up in the air for target practice. It is impossible to imagine the crying and the screaming of the parents. This was the end of Jewish children in the ghetto.
So this is the best that we understand is where we lost the brother that we never knew, Ephraim Ryback, Zichrono Livracha, a little baby, little over 1 year old. Shlomo was sent out of the ghetto on a forced work detail. And when word came that the Germans were preparing an action to slaughter the children, my mother knew that she had to do something. As a nurse, forced to work for the Germans in the town jail, she smuggled morphine into the ghetto, fearing that her baby, who had been hidden before in the first children's action, would be tortured to death because they would not leave until they had every last child. Chana and her sister Mirka injected the children and put the babies to sleep forever. Upon his return to the ghetto, my father, Shlomo, was bereft. And he was a gentleman, but he was so angry. He didn't know who to be angry at. Chana's agonizing decision would torment their lives forever, even while rebuilding their family after the war. They never spoke about it to me and Jaime until 1999, or 1990, I'm sorry, when I began to document their stories. Most of the information that I did have about the action was gathered from relatives and people who had been there. So the liquidations continued in Novogrodek, and the original 11,000 Jews rounded up from the region, from the different towns nearby. They would bring in a group into Novogrodek, separate them, take them out to a field, shoot them, bring in another group. So the Periscope ghetto was the staging ground for liquidation. In the end, a little over 500 Jews were left from that original over 11,000. These 500 people were moved into the forced labor camp that is the picture on top. And even that was very overcrowded, and they had to do something about it. So liquidations were going to continue. Chana and Shlomo moved into those yellow barracks outside the courthouse. Of the people who were remaining, of the 500, there were 300 women, 32 teenagers, and about 200 men. They all had specific skills that were useful to the Nazis, and they had those work papers, and that's why they made it that far. There were furriers, tailors, cobblers, metal workers, furniture makers, domestics, even barbers and hairdressers were the people that were taken into that forced labor camp. The housing was horrible in those barracks. Each barrack was heated with a small tin oven, and that they used for heat and the very little bit of cooking of stuff they were able to smuggle in from the guards. Water was collected in pails twice a day from a well outside the gate under police escort. There it was possible to trade small things to the policemen who were the non-Jews in the area. And as it happens, many of those policemen that were guarding the labor camp were people that the people inside had known, their former neighbors, and they did smuggle things in and out for them. The end came, though, on May 7th. The axe was about to fall. At morning roll call, of these 500 people who were left, only 260 of the best specialists were called and sent to work. The remaining people were surrounded, beaten, and forced out the gate. They were then shot. The 260 prisoners knew that it was only a matter of time before they too would be killed. And they hatched a plan to survive.
So at this point, as my mom has described, there's really this kind of element of desperation set in. They realized they were not going to survive the war. Even though they were prison laborers, they were on starvation rations in terrible conditions and progressively being killed. But as you can imagine, when this first plan to dig a tunnel and escape was hatched, everyone thought, people were worried, they were terrified, they thought it was a little bit crazy, and there was actually a lot of debate about it. But eventually, they made the plans to escape, and the details of that are really quite remarkable. They began construction of the tunnel out of the ghetto in May of 1943. And there's a quote that says, "The guillotine sharpens the mind." There were no engineers in this group of people. These were people who had to rely on the skills that they had and their own resilience and resourcefulness to do something that at first glance sounds absolutely insane, with the Nazis being quite on top of every single aspect of their lives. They were weak, they were exhausted, they were being worked literally to death. The idea of being able to do this and making it work just seemed absolutely astonishing. But it really is about ingenuity and perseverance and determination determination created with sweat that created the miracle that allowed them to get out. And this really is the largest successful escape of Jewish prisoners in the Shoah. And successful is important. It is true that there were other escapes, including the very famous one from Sobibor, of which, unfortunately, there were far fewer survivors. We know that not every single person participated. Of the 260, only 240, for whatever reason, actually participated in the escape. We know the names of 218 of them that have been documented by archivists and historians in the museum. 122 of those who escaped made it to liberation, which in this part of Europe was 1944, July 1944. 68 people died during the escape itself, and the fate of 36 of them is simply unknown. There was no way to document what actually would happen. So as I showed you in the earlier image here, this is where the tunnel was built. It was built underneath one of the beds. Outside of the prison camp itself. The tunnel itself was 208 meters long, which is really just an astonishing length. I'll show you some images from the ground now that they've excavated it. The dimensions of the tunnel were only 27 inches by 27 inches. Now, if you suffer from claustrophobia like I do, I can tell you that is a very, very small space. You are slithering along on hands and knees or on your belly. The tunnel was dug 1 meter underground. The tools that they used were very rudimentary. They were either stolen from the workshops or they created them, made them themselves while they were in the workshops and supposed to be doing other things. Construction itself began in May of 1943, and in the end, the escape happened on September 26th. And how they did this is really remarkable. They chose the 50 shortest men. They rotated them digging in pairs in 2-hour shifts. Don't forget, these people were exhausted. These were slave laborers on minimal rations, if anything, that would come off their long shifts and sacrifice sleep in order to go into this dark, humid, sweaty tunnel and be able to pull things out. And one of the biggest issues for digging a tunnel is dirt. What do you do with all that dirt, especially when the Nazis are watching everything they're doing? So initially they sewed bags in the workshops and pulled the dirt out that way. Then they actually built a platform on rails into the tunnel, and they put together a sort of wheelbarrow that went on the rails. They could pull out larger amounts of dirt. But where do you put it? So they started building false walls and false floors inside the barracks building, which were already very, very cramped, in order to hide it. They convinced the guards to let them build a second latrine, and that was a way to just hide additional amounts of dirt. Fortunately, the conditions, unfortunately, the conditions were horrible inside the barracks. So the Germans never wanted to go in there. It was very dirty. It was very smelly. And that's why they didn't discover the entrance to the tunnel literally underneath one of the beds. They used wooden planks from the bed frames to shore up the sides of the tunnel, because obviously you didn't want it to collapse on people as they were making their way out. And they tried to light the tunnel. And the story was that when they initially started using gas lamps and flames to dig, they would be snuffed out. There wasn't enough oxygen inside the tunnel, obviously a problematic issue. So someone came up with this very ingenious way of using cone-shaped air shafts that barely showed on the surface but admitted air into the tunnel itself. One of the prisoners brilliantly figured out how to tap into an electrical line that the Nazi guards were using for searchlights for the camp. And in fact, he even engineered occasional flickering lights and brownouts and blackouts of the searchlights just so the Nazis would get used to that, and then use that to actually put lights inside the tunnel so that they would be able to get out. So really, it was really quite remarkable that they were able to figure all of this out and to be able to engineer this. There's some images from the excavation. You can see this follows along the lines. And just if you imagine crawling this distance on your belly, it really is, it's quite remarkable. This is the entrance to the tunnel. This is part of the Museum of Jewish Resistance in the original barracks. This is the actual entrance to the tunnel, which has since been excavated, that went down underneath. And they have actually put along the path of the tunnel, there's now, they've lit it up and they've put like a plexiglass cover at the surface so you can look down and see what it looked like inside. And Maya, I think you are going to tell us a little bit about the lists, about how people were getting around to doing this.
Yep. So on the eve of the escape, everyone received a piece of paper which had the name of the person after whom he or she was supposed to descend into the tunnel. And of course, this is because if one person is found, they don't want to have everyone who participated, they don't want the entire list to get out. So it was important to keep it quite secret. And they had managed to acquire a small collection of weapons, which they divided into two parts. So one part was for those who went in first and could offer resistance in case the police waited at the tunnel exit. And the other part was for those who controlled the tunnel entrance. So there were two people from the organizing committee who were armed with pistols, and they stood at the entrance of the tunnel watching the order and the sequence. And they also had to be careful if the police found out and came to the entrance of the tunnel, they had to block the entrance so that those who were already inside could in fact escape.
I'm just going to jump in here first, Mum, before you talk about the next part, which is to say that the original plan for the tunnel was actually that it was only going to be 100 meters long, and it was going to be in July that they would make the escape. And what they had planned is that there was a wheat field that the wheat would be very high in late July, and therefore it would hide the escapees as they exited the tunnel. Unfortunately, the night before the planned escape, the farmer coincidentally plowed that field. And so there was no cover anymore. So you can imagine the frustration and desperation. They went back to the drawing board and they added another 108 meters to the tunnel, which is why instead of July, it took place in September. And now it came up in a cornfield quite a bit of a distance further away where they would be able to have some cover as they exited.
So they waited for a moonless night while the corn stalks were high, and they practiced before the escape. They were very careful. They said they timed it to 48 minutes for everyone to crawl through the tunnel. The first slide just before showed the handwritten list. So that was found, and that's how we found out. Oh, my camera is flipped, I hear. Okay. How's that? And that's how we found out the names of the people from that yellowed paper that was falling apart. What you see here is the other one now that since in the museum, and you can see numbers 109 and number 110 were my parents. When it came time for 109 and 110 to go into the tunnel, Chana froze. She froze with terror and she would not budge. Shlomo was afraid to, he encouraged her. He grabbed some cloths that were lying around that they had used to fill make the sandbags, tied them together and tied around his waist and her waist, and literally pulled her down into the tunnel. And you know, after that, she really had a fear of going down into dark places and actually even going down into light places. She would never take a down escalator. She was fine going on an up escalator, but would never descend down. And she said maybe it was from that moment.
So I think I've got a short film clip here from a Belarusian film to give you a sense of what it might have been like. So that was just a short clip from a film that about this escape that I just thought was useful to help kind of document what this might have sounded like. And I know, Maya, that you have some more information about the escape.
Yeah. So at 9 p.m. on the night of the escape, the searchlight blinked several times, then it went out, and this was the signal to actually start. So the guards ended up discovering the escape as the last prisoners were crawling out of the tunnel and shot them on the spot. And Bera Yoselevich, who was the chief organizer of the tunnel project and of the escape, was killed near the village of Gorodechno the day after, at only 39 years old.
So here are the pictures, the actual pictures of Tuvia and Milka Bielski. And of course, Daniel Craig played Tuvia. And there is Zeus and Sonia. Liev Schreiber was Zeus. And Chaya and Asael Bielski. Asael, well, you'll hear the story about what happened to him after.
And then we just have a poster with a movie poster that I know many of you saw the film screening beforehand and have a chance to see it. And if you don't get a chance to see it streamed through the synagogue, we do strongly encourage you to take a look at it, because the plot points were very well researched and documented, and it does present a historically accurate depiction overall. So Maya, I'll let you talk us about the Into the Forest section.
So when everyone emerged from the tunnel, they all took off into different directions. And as you saw in the little clip that was played, they all discarded the yellow patches. They knew if they all stayed together, there was a higher chance they would be caught. So my great-grandparents, Hannah and Shlomo, stayed with a group of only about 20 other people. They knew there were a number of Russian and even a few Jewish partisan groups that were based in the nearby forests. And they knew that somewhere in the woods, they could find the Bielski partisan scouts who would be looking for Jewish refugees. So a few days after the escape, they ended up tracking down a Polish farmer, Yarmolowicz, who they had heard might be willing to help Jews. And when they broke into his house, he ended up taking them to his barn and granary, where it turns out he'd been hiding other Jews. And upon leaving the ghetto, my great-grandfather's foot had been wounded, but instead of turning them away because he might have been a liability, Yarmolowicz actually brought them cotton and helped to clean and bind his wound. He even brought them a notably unkosher bucket of pork soup, which had lots of potatoes and onions and lard. And although he'd kept kosher his entire life, my great-grandfather would go on to describe it as one of the best meals he had ever eaten. However, the escapees couldn't actually stay. Yarmolowicz warned them that one of his own farmhands was spying for the Germans, and they'd soon have to move on. He did point them, though, in the general direction of the Bielski Chad, and he warned them that if they were to survive, they would have to know how to act like real partisans. So he led them to a house and told them to rake for supplies, saying, "Go to the next farm tomorrow night and invade like real partisans." The small group set out and they were armed with carved wooden sticks that they were disguising as guns. And this probably marks the first introduction to the life of a partisan for them. Eventually, another sympathetic Polish farmer directed them to an area where he knew the Jewish partisans would pass by. And early the next morning, they heard a wagon full of Jewish partisans singing Russian and Jewish songs, and they knew that they had finally found the Bielski Chad.
So just a quick word about this map that you're seeing. You see Novogrodek is that big yellow. Stankiewicz, the orange dot, that is the town that the Bielski brothers grew up in. It was a small town. There were 12 houses, and they were the only Jews, but they ran the mill. So those green spots just around there are the first forests that they went to. And in the film Defiance, it is in that particular sparse forest that the film was shot. If you remember the scene of the winter in the camp, they were already about 200 people, and they knew in the spring that the Germans were starting to find them. There was a bounty on Bielski's head, and they wanted a reward for anyone that would catch him. So they all started moving through that swamp, if you remember, and finally crossed that river to that Naliboki Puszcza. That is a dense, huge forest, it's often called the lungs of Poland. And it was really providing them excellent cover. the parents, when they escaped from the tunnel, and the other few escapees met up with them in the Naliboki Puszcza. That is where they were. And the story doesn't, in the Defiance, doesn't actually go there. Look at the distance, though. There was no carts that they had at their disposal. There were no trains. My father said to me, I said, how did you get from Novogrodek and the tunnel? How did you get to the Naliboki Puszcza? It must have been about 20 kilometers. So there was a series of safe houses that they were taken to from through the forest. And he said, oh, we camped on number 11. Number 11 are your 2 feet. They walked. And afterwards, it was always a joke in the house. Oh, I have to go here and there. He said, take number 11 and you'll get there. So the partisans gathered my parents into their wagon, and the Defiance film does not actually even focus on that part. This was a beautiful camp by this time. The Bielski boys had been in the woods for almost 4 years and finally knew how to set up a camp very quickly. They were brought to a small temporary infirmary that had been set up to care for the ghetto escapees. The infirmary was an underground bunker called a Zemlyanka, and it was about 2 kilometers away from the main partisan camp. The tunnel and other escapees from the other ghettos and towns that made their way were often very sick and carried lice and often typhus. So they had to be kind of cleaned up before they could go into the main camp. Here they were able to wash, drink clean water, eat some food while they rested. They stayed there in quarantine with a partisan named Wolf, who cared for them for almost a week. When they recuperated, Wolf took them to the Bielski camp. They were welcomed to the partisan camp by the commander, Tuvia Bielski, a handsome, big man sitting astride a beautiful white horse. He had a gun slung across his shoulder. They could not believe their eyes. They saw a community of Jews who were smiling and seemed healthy. By this time, in the fall, the partisan camp was a well-organized community, and you'll see in a moment all the services that they had. It answers the question is, how did they have all these things? They built a camp that was able to supply services to the other partisan camps in the area. So the film that you saw focused on the early days of the original camps. The group grew from a family of members to close to 200 people, then 400 people. By the time my parents got to the Camp Jerusalem, that they called it, in October of 43, liberation, there were about 400 people. When they left at liberation and walked out, there were 1,250 people.
So this gives you a kind of plan of the family camp. And when we went there in 2019, we had the good fortune to be able to tour this. It is now an archaeological site. And the image that I use at the beginning of this presentation of the trees shows you the main road, which is the main street. This, you can imagine, when there's over 1,200 people in the camp, this really was a thriving small town. And that main street is still very, very much visible, which is really quite astonishing. And you can see, as Maya and my mom will describe, there were all kinds of different workshops. People would walk up and down the street, and they had very good relations with the surrounding peasants. They knew the backwoods very well. The Bielskis themselves were probably, running vodka or things like that ahead of the war. So they really knew. Their parents, when the Nazis came, said to them, "You boys, you know the woods. You go out and save Jews." And that's what they did. They had the skills to be able to survive in the backwoods, and they understood it. Their youngest brother, Aaron, I'll show you a picture of him. He is 93, must be about 94, 95 now. We were Zooming with them in a reunion recently, so he's still well. He was a young teenager at that time, one of the youngest of the brothers, and they knew the forest extremely well. They knew also how to communicate with the people around them, not just the Jewish neighbors. And they made it their goal from the very beginning, not just to fight the Nazis, but to save Jewish lives. This was one of the only partisan groups that we know of that accepted women, elderly, children, young teenagers. Most of the partisan groups would only accept men with guns. Occasionally, they accepted women who were willing to fight. But this group accepted everyone, and their goal was really to save Jewish lives, whoever they actually were. So this is the main street as it was when we saw it in 2019. And as we toured it with the other descendants, there are still many artifacts that we picked up along the way. This is an image from the very early days when they set out into the woods, the initial family members. You can see an image here of an entry into the Zemlyanka, or the dugouts that actually became their homes, what it looked like inside. They had raised platforms for the beds. It was warm in the winter and cold and cool enough in the summer because it was underground. Maya, I'll let you tell us a little bit more about the what life was like in the part of Bielski camp.
Yeah, sure. So, as you saw in the picture earlier, they were dugout huts that were erected in two long rows, and on both sides of the main street. And each hut had a number and even a nickname depending on the origin of the occupiers or their trade. So, for example, there was a hut number 11, which was called Intelligentsia, because the camp doctor Hirsch, a woman dentist from Pinsk, a lawyer Volkovsky from Baranovich, and a few other professional people lived there. And the main street was really a major traffic route. It was always alive with all sorts of people and all sorts of things going on. People walked around in typical partisan uniforms. So that was generally peasant garb. There's a bit of military in there, a strange combination of both Russian and peasant furs. They wore army caps, Russian or German, or fur caps. And friends gathered in the main streets, as did groups of guests. So that was people from other partisan groups who came to acquire things that the Bielski tribe was able to make there. There were a total of about 27 doctors and a staff of nurses in the hospital and the infection ward. That was my bubby mentioned earlier, where they were first staying because, of course, they were all scared of typhoid. In the huge room, there's a huge room in the center of the camp where there were a bunch of workshops. There was 18 tailors who altered and repaired clothes. About 20 shoemakers who repaired and sewed shoes, and saddlers who made saddles and belts. Joiners made both windows and butts for rifles. Blacksmiths shod horses and made parts for repairs of weapons. They sewed hats in a hat shop, and they ground flour at a mill. There was a bakery that made several different sorts of bread, a sausage shop, a hairdresser, a watch workshop, and a school, and a bathhouse and a soap factory. So really its own kind of small, independent little town. My great-grandmother Chana, she worked with Dr. Hirsch in the infirmary, and my great-grandfather Shlomo, he worked at the school and he drove the ambulance wagon. So really it was like its own independent, small working town.
So these are just some images of Zemlyankas we just want to share with you. This is from the reunion. Now a lot of the dugouts, of course, have collapsed in on themselves, and the reunions we were at the reunion, we walked through the forest. There's a lot of things growing, berries, nuts, mushrooms. These are some of the artifacts that are being preserved at the museum that they were able to pull out of the forest itself. This is a pretty remarkable story. When we were there, this is a woman named Lola who was an infant. She is one of the youngest Bielski cousins. I think she was about 6 months old when the Nazis came in, and they realized they could not have babies and very small children in the Bielski Forest, Jerusalem. It just was not possible. Babies or children could cry out, they couldn't control themselves, and they might give them away to the Germans who were trying to hunt them down. So what the Bielskis did was they took Lola and some of the other infants to the people, the non-Jews in the surrounding villages, and they made arrangements with them in an elaborate charade. They left Lola as an infant in a basket on a windowsill, and this family came out and, oh, there's a baby. And then they brought it to the police captain, who had been alerted and decided that, of course, she was not Jewish. In fact, luckily, she was a girl. And the family adopted Lola and kept her throughout the war. When liberation happened in 1944, the Bielski family came back to get her, and the family didn't want to give her up. So they actually, in the middle of the night, broke in and kidnapped her back to her own family. Another remarkable story is another one of the Bielski children was 18 months old, and she had already begun to speak. And of course, she spoke Yiddish. that was a problem. So they were able to make arrangements for a family to take her in. And what they did was they kept her for 6 months with someone in the potato cellar in their house, where she forgot how to speak Yiddish and learned how to speak Polish. Now, when we first gave this presentation, I just knew this story because Lola herself told it to us when we were in the woods. But the family of this woman got in touch with me and said, "That is my mom." And I blurred out her face for her own privacy here, but she shared pictures when she went back in the 90s with her family before the museum was constructed. She tracked down the family that had taken her in. This is the house where she was hidden. This is a picture of her with another family member at the entrance to the cellar, the potato cellar. She said that when they lifted up the floorboards, the scent of the potato cellar was overwhelming. And she just had this, like, she was a small infant, obviously, and didn't remember very much, but there was this instant, the way smell evokes memory in this incredibly powerful way. The other thing that she shared is their family made it to the Bielskis, but not through the tunnel escape. They were, as the Bielskis partisans were out, they put the word out, they were looking for Jews to take in and save them. Their family was trying to make their way over to the Bielski camp, and they were taken in by another village. These are very poor people who risked their lives. If the Nazis had found them, they would have been shot, their whole families would have been shot, their animals would have been shot, and their homes would have been burned down to the ground. That was what they threatened. This family agreed to take them in for one night on their way over, give them food, give them shelter. The next morning they left, and they made their way to the Bielskis and survived the war. And this is a picture from the 90s where they went back, and she tracked down one of the women from that family. She was a girl at the time. And the girl, who's now an older woman, obviously, told her that the next day the Nazis came looking for the Jews and discovered that one of them had forgotten their dentures in a glass. And they decided, the Germans, that no, only a Jew could afford dentures. And they took her parents out and shot them. So there was an ending to this that was very tragic. They gave their lives to save these people, and she welcomed this family back very, very warmly, and nevertheless was glad to have them come through. A few other images from the reunion. This was quite remarkable. This is my mom with my uncle, my two cousins. This was the first time in 75 years that we danced the hora, we had someone brought a fiddle. There were people speaking German, there were people from South Africa, from Australia, from all over the US, from Israel, from all over Russia, Canada, Latin America, gathered together. We didn't even all speak the same language, but we danced together in the woods, and it really was an incredibly moving experience. This is an image of us with our cousins, the Kushners, at one of the dugouts. Another one of the artifacts, even as we were walking around, we saw them. And this is when the Bielski camp was liberated in July 8th, 1944, the Germans were retreating. And they were retreating from Minsk, which is east of this space, the Nelabaki forest. And they happened upon, on their retreat, they happened upon the Bielski camp, and chaos ensued. And of course, they started shooting. And 7 Bielski partisans lost their lives that day. And in the chaos of everybody, of liberation and everybody dispersing, those 7 people never had a proper funeral. So this is my friend Simon, held up an image of his grandmother's first husband, who was lost, one of the 7 lost that day. And we said prayers and a funeral service on that day to commemorate them. The surrounding villages welcomed us very, very warmly. They laid out a beautiful partisan lunch for us. We did shots of vodka with the mayor of these little towns and the people who came to join us. This is an image, the fellow in the red leather jacket here is the very remarkable Aaron Bielski, the last surviving Bielski brother, who made his way in 2019 to join us with his wife, who's also a pretty remarkable woman. And then we had the unveiling of the memorial wall that day, and we lit candles, and it was really a very moving experience. One of the things that happened on that day when we were in the forest, and I'm going to share a short clip of it now, is that the many of the survivors, there were a few of them who put together this project you might have heard of called the Violins of Hope, where they're collecting musical instruments that Jews in many of the labor camps and ghettos and camps around Europe had managed to bring in with them, and they're repairing them and using and restoring them, and they get used in some performances. Let me see if I get this right. The granddaughter-in-law of Asa Bielski, who lost his life in liberation, is now a concert violinist for the University of Istanbul Orchestra. And she brought her violin into the forest that day in July 2019 when we visited. She had some family members, and she started an impromptu performance in honor of her family members who had been there and what they had gone through. And we just happened upon them, and I captured this short video clip. I'm just going to share it with you. So she started playing Avinu Malkeinu, and it really just was quite remarkable. So. I'll hand this over to you, Mom, for the epilogue.
So, living well is the greatest revenge. After the war, they all returned to Novogrodek and got papers, because all the Soviets in Soviet land, you had to have identity papers. So they were Soviet citizens, went to Novogrodek, then they had to get false papers, leave Novogrodek, leave Stalinist Russia, and they made their way somehow with the help of the Brigade to Italy. And the plan was to go to Israel on the illegal aliyah. So our DP camp was, oddly enough, Castel Gandolfo, the summer Vatican. And there's a picture of my parents, Chana and Shlomo, and my twin brother and I. They were blessed with a 2-for-1 after the war. So you want to show some more pictures of the next slide, Alissa? Yeah, these are just other pictures of us and the DP camp. And they really treasured the coming back to full life. Here are our emergency identity certificates that we needed to come to Canada, because at the last minute, Chana again dug her heels and said, I'm not going to Palestine. They're still fighting a war. I'm not going to another war. Find us a place to go in America. And we had found a sponsor, and these are emergency identity pictures. You can see at the bottom, my mother with my brother and I. Just a picture, the 2 little kids in the front were my brother and I in the DP camp. Here is an important picture. It's Jaime's bar mitzvah. So here we are in Canada, 9 years after they left Europe. We were born in 1946, and the bar mitzvah was in 1955. How they managed to put together bar mitzvah is beyond me. 80% of the people, other than the musicians here, were part of the partisan group. But these people were related to us. Tuvia Bielski was there, but he didn't make it in the picture. You can see my brother and I, flanked by Chana and Shlomo, and the woman to the left of my mother is Ray Kushner. That was her story, the 16-year-old girl whose testimony was of the blood on the stones. Her husband is in back of her, and she is the great-grandmother of Jared Kushner. So next, oh yes, and here is Jaime's bar mitzvah, and we are toasting the survival, redemption, and moving forward, and how the parents were able to scrimp and save. on a teacher's salary, on a nurse's salary, to make a bar mitzvah, to celebrate the good things in life. This is a picture of the people who sponsored us, as Celia and Isidore Ryback took us into their house, had never met us. They had a little house in Esplanade, and we lived there until we got settled. The man on the left actually was a gym teacher at the Shar Zion school. Some of you might recognize him, Leon Ryback. He had left Novogrodek before the war. He is the only surviving relative of either of my parents' families. Or he was the only one. That's a picture of Tuvia Bielski with the glasses in the front row at his 85th birthday. And survivors came out to feed him. My parents are the two people in the 2 rows behind him with their glasses. And this is, for those of you who went to Herzliya, Talmud Torah, or any of the Jewish day schools, are the teachers of the United Talmud Torah. My dad, Shlomo, the tall man in the back in the middle with his head up in the trees, is there. You might recognize Melech Magid and his wife, Mrs. Magid, beside him. Anyways, if you look at this picture, there are many faces that you will recognize. The woman in the front was my grade 1 teacher who decided that Jaime could not have a Hebrew name. He needed an English name. His name was Amitzur. She said, Amitzur in America and Canada, you will be Jaime. And Sipora, she said, Sipora in Canada, you will be Sylvia. So talk about cultural identity appropriation. It was way back then. Here's a picture of grandparents, from the 2 people. These are the grandchildren.
Great-grandchildren.
The great-grandchildren that came out of the forest. Truly, it is a story. I like to think of this as our Haggadah as well, of redemption. And being able to do this with my daughter and granddaughter is really passing it on midor lidor.
Just a note, after the war, Asael joined the Red Army to continue the fight, and he was killed very shortly after liberation. Zush and Tuvia and their families made their way to British-occupied Palestine. They fought in the Israeli War of Independence. They made their way eventually to the U.S., where Zeus created a successful trucking company in New Jersey, and Tuvia made his way to New York in the 1950s and became a truck driver and then a taxi driver. Just a couple words about telling the story and the importance of doing, I guess, what we're doing here right now. This is Jack Kagan. He was one of the youngest survivors. He was a young teenager who made his way through the tunnel escape. In fact, he tried to escape earlier on his own and lost a number of toes to frostbite that had to be amputated, was sent back, made his way back to the ghetto, and made it out through the tunnel and was then part of the Bielskis. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union, when the Iron Curtain fell, he's a historian and was made his way to Britain. He went back to Novogrodek, where he met Tamara, who's the director of the museum. She was then the director of the Historical Society, and he said, "I'd like to see the tunnel." And she said, "What tunnel?" The Soviets, in their re-engineering of the story of what happened after the Second World War, did not talk about the Jews that had been lost. Even, they were 63% of the population, but really buried, essentially. And she knew nothing about it, but she was just this incredibly bright, inquisitive woman, determined to find out. And so he and she were part of the original catalyst for documenting what happened and then unearthing the tunnel. This is Tamara on the left with the mayor of Nalabucky. They were welcoming us when we came for the reunion in 2019. This is the memorial wall at the Museum of Jewish Resistance in Novogrodek. Every single one of the people who made their way out of that tunnel has their own name, and memorial candles were lit, and it was unveiled when they were in 2019. Very, very moving to have their names recorded. There isn't that much recording outside in Belarus in general. I mean, this is a mass grave. It was a killing pit in Minsk. These are apartment buildings next to it, and this is a beautiful sculpture created by an Israeli sculptor, but quite unusual because actually, although there are mass graves all over this region, there is not very much documentation of it. A film crew from Israel came and excavated the tunnel. There's a film called Tunnel of Hope. Jack Kagan and then his son Michael Kagan, who also is a filmmaker and historian, produced these documentaries where they went back to find the tunnel and to document the fact that this was an important part of history that had never actually been told. Part of, I think Maya said earlier, that when people are absolutely desperate, they will do anything and everything they can to survive. By the time they got to the point where they were making the tunnel and getting out, she said there were no weaklings left. These were people who had seen untold traumas and survived. And they were willing to do anything they could to preserve their lives and to get out, which is really quite amazing. We know that there are over 30,000 documented stories of Jewish resistance during the Shoah. There's probably many more of those, but those are stories that weren't documented and were never told. And this is really important to us because this isn't always how the Shoah is taught or told or relayed to people. And I feel very strongly that although we must speak of generational traumas, I really feel that we also need to find these generational strengths. I feel that this is something that our grandparents passed down to me, to my mom, to my children, and my niece and nephews as well, my cousins' kids, that we feel really honored to pass this legacy of incredible strength and resilience to our children. I am going to take us next to this. This is many of you will know this, and I'm probably saying it wrong. Mom, you'll tell me. Zog mit Keinmal, am I saying it right?
Zog mit Keinmal as du gehst den letzten Weg.
So
Never say you're going the last road.
This is the partisan song that many of you will know. This is part of another project that is also really amazing, where they're going around the world and videoing children all over the world singing this song, and then they edit these together into these amazing stitched versions of the song. And so this is children and school children across Eastern Europe and Russia singing. So I'm just going to show you a short video clip from here.
Weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Bein, mit unser Wein. Und wie gewohnt ist der Spritz von unser Blut. Spritzen wenn dort unser Glore, unser Gott. Und wie kommen wenn dort unser ausgedehnte Schau. Selber warten unser Traum, wir seinen Gott. So wie Engels, du gehst den besten Weg. Musimy daje waszym wojnie. Jeśli my nie rozwinę nasz bój, полетит потоком песня как порой. Если мы не rozwinę nasz bój, полетит потоком песня как порой.
So many of you will know this. I've got just some of the words up here, transliterated in Yiddish on the left and in English, just so that you can see what the words are. I'm also going to just, in the next slide, I'll show you in just a moment, we have some additional resources. If you want to learn more about these stories, the Bielski partisans are somewhat better documented, but since they've learned more about the tunnel, that is again becoming more of something that people are documenting. There is a film called The Tunnel of Hope. This is produced by Michael Kagan, who I talked about, and Dror Shorts with Tamara Vershitskaya. The Book of Curses, which is actually it is a book. They don't know actually who wrote this. They say Benjamin Berkovich, but they have no information about him. It was smuggled out of the Novogrodek labor camp by a sympathetic German guard. And it is literally just, whereas many of the books and things that came out of the Holocaust maybe are about forgiveness or moving on. This one really is not. It's really an amazing and very dark piece of writing. There's a new book that's about to come out now that's being written by a woman named Betty Cohen in Israel, where she has written a documented short history of every single person who escaped from the tunnel, including my grandparents. You will know, of course, about the film Defiance. That was from 2008. It is based on a book by Nechama Tech that was written in 1993, an excellent book. There is a model of the Novogrodek labor camp and a tunnel for children to crawl through at the Imperial War Museum in London. And there is mention at the Berlin Holocaust Museum as well of the Bielski Partisans. I'm sure there are others, but we just wanted to compile a short list of additional resources for people who are interested. One other one that I should add, if there's teachers on this presentation, the Jewish Partisans Educational Foundation is a fantastic nonprofit resource that has ready-to-go lesson plans, printed collateral, short videos for children of all ages to teach them about partisans and resistance in the Shoah. I'm very happy to connect you to them. The woman Sherry who leads us is a remarkable woman, but they also have a Facebook page. It is the Jewish Partisans Educational Foundation, JPEF, and they document, they have pictures and just fantastic resources that people can use to take these stories of resistance out and make sure that they're shared. And with that, Mom, Maya, I don't know if there's anything else that you guys want to add other than to thank everybody for taking your time.
I thank everybody, and thank you, Alissa and Maya, for allowing me to put the words of our story into your mouths. And with that, I say good night and thanks to everybody.
And thank you again, Adam and Howard and everyone who helped make this possible. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much, Alissa, Sylvia, Maya, and Howard. And as I said at the opening of tonight's session, this now becomes our obligation, and our obligation to retell all that we heard tonight. And if you don't remember some of it, as there was so much information to absorb, I will make this session available on Shar Zion's website. It'll probably be up as of tomorrow late morning. That if you want to revisit this session and this program to relearn some of the facts that you heard tonight, you will be able to do that as of tomorrow. And we hope that we will all continue to share this story. And if anyone would like to watch the movie, it is still available. I will put the link in the chat box. Thanks, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.